It really seemed to come to a head, at least for me, during the campaign a couple of years ago, or I guess a year ago. And the dialogue just got so harsh, so mean, so really disrespectful of all of us as human beings and of each other. And it does spread, it does catch. I mean, I found myself on Facebook, feeling quite agitated, doing some postings that later I thought, I just felt bad as I was doing it. I thought, this doesn't feel open. I feel constricted. And I realized I was catching it. And so I really just kind of stopped and stepped back and really started looking more deeply at the Buddha's teachings on what he would call upright and noble speech, which are really wonderful and are so important to our practice. We're all here because we are either on or exploring this spiritual path. And part of being together in Sangha, Thich Nhat Hanh would often teach us to be a community of resistance. So I think that we should resist the sickness of mean speech. And really, it's easy to look at other people, it's easy to look at mean tweets and to kind of point fingers. But I find, and I think a lot of us find, if we look in our own hearts, if we look at just some of the conversations we have with people that we care about day to day, with coworkers, maybe even our email responses, that, we all harbor some of that in us. So I wanted to take a little time this morning to look at what the Buddha taught that I think is 2,600 years later still incredibly relevant and helpful. It's been very helpful for me to look at in terms of transforming some habit energy that is harmful and that spreads, and instead to how can I cultivate kind, loving, affectionate, honest speech that's going to be beneficial for others as well instead. So I think it was interesting that in the Buddha, when he got up from the Bodhi tree, one of the first, actually his first teaching after enlightenment was the Four Noble Truths. And those are that there is suffering, that there is a cause of suffering, there's a path out of suffering, and that path is the Eightfold Path. And one of those steps is right speech. So he really spoke a lot about this point of right speech. And one of the collections that's very loved and valued of the Buddha's teachings is the Dhammapada. And this is a collection in verse form of a lot of the Buddha's teachings. And there's one in particular that really, I think, speaks beautifully about speech that I wanted to share. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows like a never departing shadow. So the Buddha's telling us here that really, as Marilyn shared so beautifully in this loving kindness meditation, that it's beginning in the mind, it's beginning in the heart. When we cultivate loving kindness to others, and Marilyn led us through loving kindness for ourselves, for people that we love, for people that we're indifferent to, and for people that we have a difficult relationship with. This is not just a nice practice. This is an essential practice on our path. In our minds and our hearts, we harbor anger, irritation, or maybe a sense of me that doesn't value other people quite at the same level. So we really, in Buddhist practice, want to work to transform our hearts and our minds. And when we are acting with a pure heart, then our words, our deeds will naturally be pure. So, as we work to transform our speech will transform. But in the meantime, while we're not still Buddhas and we're working to do that transformation, we have a lot of habit energy. We have ways that we react, we respond, we may be a little sarcastic, we interrupt, we do all kinds of things, or we just kind of react in anger sometimes. So fortunately, the Buddha knew that, and he also gave us other tools, other teachings that while we are transforming our heart and our minds, that we can follow. And one are the 5 precepts. So with the Buddha's 5 precepts, the fourth was, do no harm, refrain from, speech that hurts others. So even though we might be thinking stuff inside because we haven't totally transformed that mind and heart, we can zip it to not do harm to others. It's important while we're on this path that if we're trying to transform our minds and our hearts, but we're still acting out, that's going to be a huge obstacle to our transformation. So the Buddha taught we don't want to speak or act in ways that are not with integrity, in ways that would harm other people. So he talked about speech there as well. Thich Nhat Hanh, many of you are familiar with his 5 mindfulness trainings, which are basically his interpretation of the 5 precepts, really looking at them over time with more and more elaboration to give us guidance in daily life. And I won't read his most current version, but essentially, if I can paraphrase, he's saying, if my speech isn't mindful, if I don't listen deeply to other people, then we're all going to suffer. But if I listen deeply, if I practice, mindful speech, I can bring joy to the world. So we want to speak in a way that's truthful, that inspires joy. And I think it's interesting that he says towards the end, essentially, watch out for anger. We had a workshop here yesterday on mindful dialogue, and we spent a lot of time, before we even talked about speech or listening, about looking inside of ourselves to see, where do we have problems with our speech? Where is that coming from? And oftentimes it's coming from a place of anger. And we've had other talks on anger, and I'm sure we'll have more in the future, but oftentimes with our speech, we're speaking in a way that's not helpful because we don't understand the other person. We're not cultivating understanding. So we have a lot of practices that we can do to cultivate a deeper understanding. But just to know with our speech, we're going to talk about some specific ways that the Buddha taught about speech, but to know that the core is in our heart, and creating a heart that's not angry, but that's patient, that's understanding, that's loving, that is going to be a wellspring of our right speech. So there are an amazing number of sutras, which are the teachings of the Buddha, that when one begins to look, that you'll find where he talked about right speech. So I started looking through some, and there's one in particular where he is teaching Kunda, who was a silversmith. And oftentimes in the sutras, the Buddha sits down in somebody's grove, and they're sitting side by side, and somebody's coming to him requesting teachings, and this is what happened with Kunda. And Kunda was asking the Buddha, first of all, the Buddha asked Kunda a question. He said, well, what purification practices do you follow, Kunda? And Kunda was not on the Buddhist path at this point. And Kunda said, when we rise, we touch the ground, or we worship the sun, or we bow to the river. There were a lot of these Brahmin sort of practices that were prevalent at that time that they thought would bring purification to the mind, to the speech, to all actions. And Kunda asked the Buddha, what practices does the Buddha recommend for purification? And the Buddha said that, in the discipline of the noble ones, in other words, his Sangha, and that would be us, we are the noble ones, one is made pure by specific actions of body, speech, and mind. And so specifically from these teachings to Kunda, I was interested in what are the verbal actions that the Buddha says we should be following. And I'll just share from that sutra what the Buddha told Kunda are these core practices of right speech. And how is one made pure in 4 ways by verbal action? There is the case where a certain person abandoning false speech abstains from false speech. When he has been called to a town meeting, a gathering of his relatives or of royalty, if he's asked as a witness, come and tell, good man, what do you know? If he doesn't know, he says, I don't know. If he does know, he says, I have seen. He doesn't consciously tell a lie for his own sake, for the sake of others, or the sake of any reward. He speaks the truth, holds to the truth, is firm, reliable, no deceiver of the world. So that was the first advice to Kunda, was that, and we'll talk about each one of these, but that we abandon false speech, we speak the truth. And for most of us, we probably feel like, well, I don't lie. But there are quite a few nuances to that that we'll look at. The second was that he abandons divisive speech. What he has heard, he does not tell to break people apart. What he has heard, he does not tell to break people apart from anyone, thus reconciling those who have broken apart or cementing those who are united. He loves concord, delights in concord, enjoys concord, speaks things that create concord. So basically, we're coming from a place of goodwill with our speech. We're not trying to break other people apart or create disconcord. Our intention is always to bring harmony, to bring benefit. The third was abandoning abusive speech. He abstains from abusive speech. He speaks words that are soothing to the ear, that are affectionate, that go to the heart, that are polite, appealing, and pleasing to people at large. So he's saying kind, affectionate speech. And then abandoning idle chatter. He abstains from idle chatter. He speaks in season, meaning really at the right time and place. Speaks about what is factual and in accordance with the goal, the Dharma. He speaks words worth treasuring. I like that. When I think about my speech and something's about to come out, it's like, is this worth treasuring? Seasonable, reasonable. That is how one is made pure by verbal action. So he's really kind of laid it out right there. And I found it just very helpful to go through this. And I'd like to share that this morning to talk about each one of these areas and what does this really mean. And perhaps something that I'll share may touch something in you. But I think it's helpful for all of us to hear and reflect and think about our own speech and our own actions. And are there ways that we might do something differently that would help create, more kindness in ourselves, in people right around us, and actually in the world. It's really got to start somewhere. So here we are. So the first of these points was speak honestly in truth, and he was telling us to abandon false speech. So obviously that means not lying, but, I think at the same time, not failing to speak up when somebody else is telling an untruth. So, when we are in situations with other people and someone is saying something that we don't know, that we know to not be true, or something that may be harmful, do we have the courage to speak up? To not exaggerate. And I think not exaggerating is interesting. Really not praising ourselves at the expense of others, or just thinking about when we're in conversations with people and somebody shares something, well, I did such and such, and we immediately want to jump in ourselves with, well, I did this. There's always the ego, this delusive thing we call the ego, posturing in conversations, wanting to be seen to look good. And so we might just watch our speech during the day and just notice when we're in conversation, is there a tendency to want to sort of exaggerate something that we've done, to be sure that that we're seen, that we look good, that may not be entirely truthful, may not be right speech. are we truthful to ourselves? So we may feel like, yeah, I'm honest with other people, but do we have ways that we deceive ourselves? Do we have habits that we don't look at, that we keep telling ourselves, this internet surfing that I do is not harmful, or whatever substance I abuse, I'm fine with it, I have it all under control. Are we really honest ourselves? Are we honest with ourselves about how we're feeling, what we're carrying around? That I may be angry, I may be sad. So I think we could start this practice of abandoning false speech by looking at our speech to ourselves and looking at, are we really honest? I mean, how can we help ourselves if we're not honest with what's really going on there? When we speak, do we speak from our own experience? And realize that when I'm talking with you, if I'm speaking with Becky and we have maybe a different view about something, do I realize that my view is just my view and it's not the truth necessarily? And I think it's interesting. Buddhism teaches us that, our experience moment to moment of anything that happens is so complex. We think we hear the rain, but there's a sound, we all have the faculty of hearing. There's a sound that we're all aware of when it's raining. And then we have all of this conditioning, our whole experience of our life in memory, whether it's very conscious or not. And we bring all of that conditioning to every experience that we have in life. So Becky may say something to me, and I bring my whole interpretation to what she meant. She's just said some words, and then I'm coming back with my whole story about what her words meant, and I think it's the truth. Anybody else ever have that experience? And we don't realize it, and we so quickly, and we glob onto it. And guess what? The other person looks at it the same way. And so we get into these, well, you did this, I did that, and we're absolutely sure. And an interesting thing, physiologically is that, when you get into somewhat of a heated conversation and there's some stress involved, actually the process that happens internally when there's stress can cause you to lose a little short-term memory. So we don't even know, what we said sometimes. It's just we're not really in the best place. So to just realize that what we think is truth may be our subjective truth. It may not be the truth, and maybe there isn't one truth in a particular situation. So what that can teach us is to be open in dialogue. Can I hear the other person? Can I be curious about how they see it and why they see it, and not just think it's my political view is right or my view of this transaction is correct. Thich Nhat Hanh has a very famous teaching that I try to remember, but not always, and that is to always ask ourselves, is it true? When we think something is true, is it true? And then ask, is it 100% true? Because I can think, I'm pretty sure that I locked, it wasn't me that didn't lock the door, it was Fred that didn't lock the door. And then if I say, am I 100% sure? No, I'm not 100% sure. And a lot of times we're kind of surprised when we find out what really happened. So, just letting go of that, I know what's true, and realizing that oftentimes what we perceive, it's our subjective experience, and that there are other possibilities. And can we just relax and be open? Because it definitely helps then how we speak and how we receive what the other person's saying. So the second area that the Buddha talked about was to speak affectionately, not with words that are harsh or abusive. And again, these practices of loving kindness, we do practices of empathy where we put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else who we have a difficult time with, and we try to see life perhaps the way it's unfolded for them so we can see something from their perspective. These types of meditations and reflections really help us to open our hearts with kindness and compassion instead of anger and impatience. Anger and impatience are simply arising because there's not understanding. So we need to be cultivating understanding in our minds and hearts to really be able to bring kind speech. if we find, and this is just a good checkup to do at any time, if I find that I want to say something and there's an energy there, and it's, anger is a big word, and we talked about this some yesterday, and we had a retreat in April where we called it the patience retreat. We actually tricked everybody. We really talked about anger a lot. There were people like, I'm not an angry person. Why is this retreat about anger? But anger's got a big family. Irritation, frustration, resentment. So maybe you don't feel like you have a lot of anger, but there's a lot of other little things that come up. And when we find that that's present in our mind, good time to not speak, because we're not speaking from a place of affection. We're probably not going to be able to be as helpful to ourselves or others in that situation when we are coming from a place that's not of affection. Do we use words that demean others or ridicule, in this area of kind and affectionate speech? And it's interesting, I find sarcasm is interesting. We're all kind of different, and sometimes I think maybe sarcasm, a lot of it comes from sort of our family, or it may be cultural, but some people use sarcasm in a way that's not quite so, to them, cutting. They may think that it's witty, and sometimes it is, but if I look up sort of the origins of the word sarcasm, it was bite flesh. And it feels like that sometimes. And, we like to feel, again, it's sort of an ego thing. We like to feel that we're funny, that we're smart, and that we're clever. And, it's kind of fun. Humor is great. However, do we stop before we say these things and think, wow, are these words going to bite someone's flesh? I mean, maybe we should look at it that way a little bit and just see, are these words going to hurt somebody? In terms of affectionate speech, one of the things that the Buddha taught, this I thought was interesting in the Flower Garland Sutra, is somebody said, is it okay to sort of slip into the speech or dialect of your family? So maybe it's not the way you normally talk, but it's a way that you kind of fit in with them. And then the Buddha said, yes, it's fine to do that. It helps us be with people completely. But we just want to do it in a way that our words don't hurt. So I kind of was thinking about, where I've done that in the past. And, when I was working in the corporate world, that's definitely sort of a type of speech, that people get into in that world. We talk a certain way. But there were a lot of put downs in that world. And so it was really a practice and I often slip down that slope too, of just, sounding like, I'm smart, I'm witty, and just putting something down and realizing that, we can talk and we can be in that world, but we don't have to let our speech go to that level. We don't have to say things that are not kind. I also have a lot of relatives who are very Southern, so can get with them. And I even noticed starting to get more of an accent. It's kind of funny that after a couple of days, it's a little more Southern going on. But again, if somebody's putting someone down or there's some sort of a group think there, just being very careful not to slip into that. I mean, I love my family. I know that they are a result of their causes and conditions. Yet, can I, lovingly stand my ground and, be with them in a way of integrity in my speech. The third of the things the Buddha talked about is to not have divisive speech, so speaking with a mind of goodwill. Our speech should unify, should reconcile, not break people apart. And all we have to do is listen to the tweets or read them or whatever you do with tweets to see how divisive the language has become in Washington. And it's really spread. I mean, just so many people across the country speaking in ways that are mean, that are derogatory, that aren't respectful of other people as human beings. And I thought it was really interesting when President Trump was in France and President Macron kind of reached out to him, and people were a little critical of the French president, saying, how can you talk to this guy? And he sort of responded that, it's better to have dialogue than, to isolate him. And I thought there's a lesson there that, with our speech, we're not going to heal the world by looking down at the world, by closing off to the world. Not by being divisive. We can use our speech to extend love to people that we know within have Buddha nature, and because of their own causes and conditions, are in a place of maybe sickness, in their psyche right now. But how do we help them? We don't help them by closing off, by being mean back. We help by, just continuously cultivating loving kindness, trying to be open and trying to communicate. We have to open those bridges. After September 11th, many of you may remember Thich Nhat Hanh, wrote a letter to President Bush, and really tried to encourage them to, didn't work unfortunately, but to talk to these people who are obviously suffering so much that they would do something so harmful. They're suffering greatly. Can we open communication and talk to them, not create more divisiveness? So such wisdom that, if we as individuals and as nations would follow, would just solve so many of the problems of the world today. I think also in speaking not divisively, we want to always just think about, again, what is our intent when we speak? Is our intent to put someone down? Is it to outdo somebody else? And think about this as we email and as we post on Facebook. To really look at, if I'm posting something and I feel strongly about it, is this something that, everybody who agrees with me is going to like it? And if I even have any friends who disagree with me, is this something that they would actually be open to and hear? Or is it just said in a way that's going to cause them to just close down even more? So, I'm all for dialogue and trying to offer up to people something that might touch their heart. But, I think it's for us to find creative ways to touch each other's hearts, to find ways to find our commonality so we can open to that dialogue with people that we may have different views from and not have it be divisive or have them feel like we're putting them down. They have people, everyone has a reason for thinking the way they do. And our path as practitioners of this Buddhist path is to cultivate understanding. So we can, instead of I'm here and this other person's over here and we're like back to back, is can we turn the same way and kind of look at something together in a way that the other feels heard and acknowledged as well. The fourth of the Buddha's teachings was speak beneficially. Our words that we offer should be of benefit to others. They should be helpful. It should not be idle chatter. He said to avoid hollow speech and speak with words worth treasuring. And I thought it was interesting. There's a sutra called the Katavata Sutra that made me realize that 1,600 years ago, things weren't so different in terms of what people talked about than now. And I guess the Buddha was walking around and he came upon a circle of monks having a conversation, and he asked what they were talking about. And they said, well, we're talking about the kings, the robbers, the ministers of state, food, clothing, perfumes, vehicles, gossip, and more. And the Buddha admonished the group, and he named 10 topics of conversation that he thought were meaningful, which included things like contentment, virtue, knowledge, vision, persistent, non-attachment, and so on. So, I know we're not monks, and our topics of conversation may be broader, yet we can still, I think, learn from this teaching of, are my words worth treasuring, or is this idle chatter? And, I think in the idle chatter category, oftentimes we find our stories. I find it interesting. We've had a lot of Sangha dinner parties, getting to know new members, and we go around the table, and people sort of tell their stories, and we want them to tell their stories because we're there to know each other. But I watch this mind, and someone tells something, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I want to say. It's like this urge to be known, but also to sometimes to impress or to entertain, or kind of a me too. And so always coming back to that practice of, is this something beneficial? I think stories can help bond us, can help us find commonality, can help us know each other. So there is a value to story, but oftentimes somebody else finishes talking and there's no space. The next person just jumps right in, well, I had this experience. So I think that's an interesting one to watch. Could I go through a day without telling my story and just listening to other people and being interested in what they have to say? And gossip, of course, is, particularly harmful. And we talk about other people. And I think if we find ourselves doing that, we want to stop and see what's the intention of talking about someone. If they were here and they heard these words, how would they feel? Is talking about this something that's being done in a beneficial way so that we can help this person? Or am I doing this because it makes me feel better by, talking about somebody else? So, all of these teachings, I think, are not to say, do this, don't do that. It's to say, let's be curious when we talk. Let's look at our intentions, and let's see why this may be right speech or not in this particular situation. And then really not one of those four, but the Buddha did mention this, and I thought it was really important. He talked about speaking in season, which very much is speaking at the right time and place. So oftentimes we may be in a conversation and we really want to speak our truth. We're going to let them know, this is the way it is, or we just have this strong urge to say something. And I think you want all of these things to be present. You want to be coming from a place of affection. You want your words to be as far as you can know. You want them to be true and well-meaning. You want them to be affectionate and not divisive. But is this the right time and place to be saying those words? Is the other person open to hearing you? Sometimes we just want to say something, but the other person's upset. And when somebody's upset or closed off, they're not going to hear our words. Or maybe we're saying them in front of other people. Just, maybe sometimes the thing to do is, we feel something strongly to think, this is something that I do need to talk about with the other person. But why don't I do it, at a time when maybe I've actually invited them saying, there's something I'd like to talk with you about that's kind of come up for me. Could we meet sometime over tea and just talk about this? So we really want to look at, is it the right time and place? And if it's not, we want to do as Shanti Deva teaches us, be a log. So oftentimes in dialogue and speech, a good thing is to be a log, is just to realize we don't have to say it now. We'll always have an opportunity later to say something. It was interesting that the Buddha was asked, and this was in connection with, he had a cousin, Devadatta, who was always trying to break up the Sangha. And he did to some extent at one point break up the Sangha. And the Buddha said some harsh words about Devadatta, but that were factual and that he felt like were necessary to say. And somebody asked him, when can one say words that are not pleasing, that may not be agreeable to someone else? And the Buddha said, if your words are factual, if they're true, if they're being said for the benefit of other beings, and if you're coming from a place of affection and care where you're really trying, this is important to say something that may be a hard truth, then we need to speak our truth. So all of this, his teachings about upright, noble speech are not about just saying things to make other people feel good. It is about speaking our truth, but it's about using wisdom and compassion to say our truth in a way and at a time that it helps other people. The final thing I wanted to share here was something that Dana Belden from the San Francisco Zen Center taught, and it's called WAIT. And it's an acronym that means, why am I talking? And I found this is really helpful for me. So when I feel this, you feel this energy to say something, just stop for a moment. Why am I talking? Is this something that's true? Is it going to be beneficial? Affection's a big one for me, because sometimes when the urge is strong, it's because there's a little bit of kind of this urge there to say something. And is it the right time and place? So ask yourself, to say, wait, and ask yourself before you speak. So I'd like us to, in just a couple of minutes, to get into small groups of maybe 3 or 4, to just share with each other if there's something that you currently practice or something that maybe you've heard this morning that may be helpful for you in your dialogue and your communications with other people to practice this upright and noble speech. And we're going to take probably 5 5 or so minutes for the entire exercise. So maybe just take a minute and just kind of go around your groups, just sharing something so that if there is something that's come up, just kind of helps you to voice it and remember it. But before we do, let me stop and just ask, are there any questions about these teachings from the Buddha on upright and noble speech that I can answer? Yes.
Yeah, I've been thinking lately about this idea of waiting for the right time to express yourself, but having difficulty about waiting for the right time to express oneself. I've been thinking a lot about that and having difficulty reconciling this idea with the fact that there's no guarantee that you will get to speak to the other person again.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, there are certainly a lot of uncertainties. We can teach, we can teach these principles, and we just simply need to do our best and use the wisdom. And there'll always be a lot of uncertainty about, is this the right time and place with respect to certain items? So I think you have to just play with that and let go of thinking that you're going to really have 100% knowledge of, is this the right time and place? You may learn through experience, and sometimes it may seem like it's the right time and place. Somebody may ask you a question like, this is the stereotypical one from my generation, a woman asking a man, do I look fat in this outfit? It's never the right time and place for him to say yes. But someone yesterday in our workshop shared they were asked at work, for feedback on something, and she gave honest feedback, and it was taken very, they didn't want to hear it. People came down and criticized her. So, sometimes we may think it's the right time and place, and we don't know what's going on with other people. So, I would think, go back and ask yourself, well, where am I coming from? Am I coming from a place of kindness and wanting to say this to this person? If it's clearly not the right time, there's other people around, and you think you're just going to have to weigh that. But experiment with some of it, and just always, I think, do it with a good heart and a good intention. And I always think, is this going to really benefit the other person? And we really don't know if it's going to benefit the other person. We're coming from what we hope will benefit them. But and see how it goes. Thank you. Yes.
And somehow they learned to hold the attention more than I learned it. And sometimes the only thing I can do is to walk away. That's the only way they will stop talking. How can I handle these situations better?
Yeah, that's always an interesting one, because oftentimes there are people that we like very much, and they really love their storytelling. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of a just to bring a little humor and lightness into it. And I have on occasion spoken with people at other times just to say, I really enjoy your story. Sometimes I feel a little bit overwhelmed because I find that I'd like to be able to share some too. So I think you have to just be kind of light with it and loving with how you approach somebody on something like that.
In working on compassionate speech towards others, I noticed that when I do loving kindness meditation, I find it easier to feel metta, loving kindness for others, than for myself a lot of the time. And I was just curious if you had any comments about that.
So is the question about the difficulty you have in finding loving kindness for yourself?
Yes.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because a lot of people, we've had loving kindness retreats, and oftentimes people find it's harder for themselves than for other people. We don't see the voice, the critical voice that we talk to ourselves in our head all the time. So I think it's oftentimes very much a process of beginning to become a friend to yourself, to look at your own wonderful qualities, which from the little I've known you shine forward, and you're quite beautiful. And I think we'll all find that in ourselves as we stop. We tend to, I think, focus on the things I think I've done wrong, and those kind of concretize a little bit in our mind instead of saying, wow, the things that I've done to help people, the many good things you've done in your life, and really, appreciate yourself. And I think you have to spend some time reflecting on that, because if we've developed sort of this story that we don't even see, and we've talked to ourselves in a particular way, it's going to take some undoing, some watching of the mind. I think that watching your mind throughout the day and noticing kind of the quality of thinking that happens, and like, oh no, why did I say that, or why did I do that? Starting to notice how judgmental we can be to ourselves. Yeah, I mean, we could do Dharma talks just on self-dialogue because it's huge, and it's actually much easier to open our hearts to other people when we open our hearts to ourselves first. So, just take care of your self-talk, appreciate yourself, and continue to offer metta to yourself. And I think you'll find your heart starting to open more to yourself.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So if we could, please, let's get into groups of 4, and we'll take really just a few, maybe take about a minute or so a person. Maybe Marilyn can just invite a little bell every minute and just kind of switch and just to share with the group if there's a practice that you have or something that maybe you've heard that you might practice to better support right speech. Thank you. If we can all come back to cushions again. Yeah, so hopefully in our sharing and our listening to the Buddha's teachings, our community of resistance is increasing our strength against this meanness and really helping us to cultivate this blossoming of kind speech and wise speech. You know, I was thinking as we were sitting here, you know, again about the question of loving kindness for ourselves. You know, the more we practice on this path, the more we begin to see who we really are. And, you know, there's a lot of judgment that we have about things that are impermanent, about, you know, actions that I've done or things, but we start to realize that that's not us. And so I wanted to add to my answer to just share that it's, you know, it's very much about seeing that our true nature, it's luminous, it's beautiful, it's open, it's wise. And the more we meditate and practice, the more we will see that, and that will naturally develop as well. So thank you for your listening and your practice of this noble and upright speech. We wanted to share a few other things before we end Sangha today. And one is I wanted to talk for just a moment about generosity. Fred was in Naples last week at a members forum, and it was interesting because one of the members said, you know, I received information about this Great Cloud Refuge residential hall that, you know, we're building that we're now in the process of raising funds from the community for. And she said, my mind's kind of been agitated. I don't know how much to give. I mean, if I give as much as I can, is it too much? Or if I give just a little bit so that I'm comfortable, am I going to feel guilty that I didn't give enough? And it was interesting. I asked Fred, well, how did you respond? And he said, you know, it basically, she was looking at it from this sort of quantifiable perspective that really should be sort of the end result, not where we start. When we, in Buddhism, we have the paramitas, these practices that really are part of the bodhisattva path, and one of the most important is the practice of generosity. And what is taught in the practice of generosity is that we want to come to life as a bodhisattva, as somebody who's here to benefit other people. So we want to look at our resources, whether it's maybe my time, my energy, or material resources like money or other resources, and always be making decisions from the perspective of, is what I'm doing going to benefit others? It's interesting how easily, at least I know with myself, we'll spend money on her. You know, yeah, get her put $5 out for a Starbucks coffee, you know, when I could make it at home probably for 20 cents, or, you know, buy clothes, home improvements, whatever it happens to be. So we find that sort of the worldly way is we have no problem being generous with ourselves. But when we come and look at, you know, how am I spending my time and energy, for example, am I spending it in a way that's just purely pleasurable, but then that fades? Or am I spending those resources in a way that'll transform myself so I can be a benefit to myself and others? So the Bodhisattva path says we use those resources to transform ourselves. And likewise, I think when we look at the center, and Betsy's going to talk about our Great Cloud Refuge in just a moment, you know, to me, I look at that as, you know, this is something that, you know, I value the Dharma so much. It's made a huge difference in my life. It's really just brought so much happiness to myself, and hopefully I've been able to help some of those around as well. And the opportunity to build something and to have retreats and to have so many people come in and to give that gift to them too. To me, on the Bodhisattva path, that's the practice of generosity. So that's, I think what Fred was sharing was that's the process that we would go through, and then we would decide, what really is this value and how do I want to support it. So I just wanted to share that because I thought it was a good question that she had and that other people might, appreciate that perspective from Fred as well.